1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel and the Nakba. And then part 3 will take it from there to essentially the present. So let's get started here with part 2. But before getting into part 2, just a recap for those of you who have not been here. The first part covered, well, the reasons for the creation of the Zionist movement by Theodor Herzl, which is basically the persecution of Jews in Europe throughout the centuries, essentially, which started for religious reasons initially by the Catholic Church for control of non-Christian population, and then evolved into more social and then political persecution. And this is particularly what I mentioned and demonstrated this was particularly a European phenomena. Jews elsewhere in the world, and particularly in the Muslim world, they were not subject to that persecution. They were second-class citizens, but they were not persecuted the same way as they were in Europe. And this was most prominent in Eastern Europe, in Russia particularly, but not only there. Actually, what prompted Herzl to go back and make a U-turn from his initial calls for the integration of Jews and assimilation of Jews by having them mass convert to Christianity, he reverted back and said that the Jews are a distinct people and there is no way that they will be integrated, therefore we have to establish a Jewish state. The event that prompted him to do that was in France, the Dreyfus affair case. A French officer who was put on trial because he was Jew. And everybody knew that. He was scapegoated. And that, here is France, the enlightened, supposedly enlightened European country, which was a source of hope for many people, including the Jews, that finally we are equal. He decided that, okay, if France is doing that, there's no hope. So that's what he established and started his movement for the separation of Jews from their countries of origin, and because they are separate and distinct nation. So this is essentially what we have talked about in the first part to demonstrate that, okay, well, the persecution of Jews is the impetus for the Zionist movement. The persecution of Jews in Europe is real, and that was the catalyst for that. But Jews have not been persecuted in the Arab countries, in Muslim countries. Actually, the golden age of Judaism was in Spain during Muslim occupation. All right. So that's the first part. And Zionism, as you can tell, until then was actually, or when Herzl proposed his idea of Zionism, it was rejected by most Jews. And if Jews actually wanted to escape the persecution, Palestine was not their choice. Their choice was the United States, the New World. That's where most of the Jews from Eastern Europe immigrated to and ended up in the United States. So, but also the Zionist movement initially did not accept, or did not, Herzl himself did not care where his state would actually or should be. They considered Argentina, they considered Uganda, they considered Palestine. There are many places. His criteria was any place that has the makings to establish a state, a viable state, and not only that, but he says, we will take whatever is given to us. Because here it is. You know, you want to establish a state where? I mean, you're going to move these people out from their countries. You need some land. You need some place. This is in 1897. That's when the Zionist movement was established. So Herzl recognized that he needed to have a sponsor to help him establish his state. Because indigenous people, any place where there are people, they're not going to accept millions of people coming in and kicking them out, right? So in 1903, Herzl, went and made the case for the colonization of Uganda to the Zionist Congress, which actually rejected it, and Palestine then was chosen in 1905 as the ultimate destination because of the connection, religious connection of Palestine to not only the Jews, but it's, I mean, for the Jews in particular, because that's a holy place to them, but it is holy to the Christians and to the Muslims too. And of course, it was inhabited at the time. So he recognized that in order to be able to fulfill his dream and his project, he needed the sponsorship of some colonial power. And who are the colonial powers at the time? Well, Germany, you know, the the Kaiser, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and all that stuff. So he went knocking on their doors. And the Kaiser and the Ottoman Sultan refused to listen to him. But the British were willing to. And so at the time, you know, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. So this is a map of the Ottoman Empire. Well, there are two maps actually in here. In the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire was weakening and was shrinking. So until 1914, the Ottoman Empire included all of North Africa, Turkey, of course, and extended up into Hungary and Armenia, and then down into the Arabic Peninsula. After 1683, it started shrinking, and in 1914, this was the extent of the Ottoman Empire, right? But because at that time in 1914, the Ottoman Empire was weakening and getting really weak, and in Europe it was known as the sick man of Europe. And everybody was kind of, looking forward to carving it up and taking that. That was the age of empire. So in 1916, France and England sit together. World War I broke in 1914, right? And in 1916, World War I, the Ottomans sided with Germany. Okay, and so the British and the French were fighting against the Ottomans and against the Germany. And in 1916, France and England and the British Empire, they sit down and decided how they're going to carve the Middle East after the defeat of the Turks. This is the map of that they came up with. Mark Sykes, and Georges Picot. Georges Picot was a French diplomat, and Mark Sykes was a British representative. He had no diplomatic experience whatsoever. No, he was just a friend of Lord Kitchener, and that's how he got access and to foreign policy and being able to sit down and negotiate. Anyway, so this is the map that they came up with. Russia also had designs. And if you look carefully, the British were kind of shrewd. They said, okay, you France take the northern part because we don't want Russia to have a border with us. You act as a buffer zone. So that's why parts of Syria and Lebanon were given to the French. You know, the British zone included Iraq, southern Syria, parts of Palestine and Jordan, and British control, direct British control, was all the Gulf states from Iraq down south. Why? Because there's oil there. Exactly. And now in Palestine, parts of Palestine, they wanted to internationalize that, not under British or French control. Later, they changed their mind. So this was before the end of the war, mind you. The war was not decided yet, but and the Zionist movement, you know, was constantly hammering on British to get access to Palestine, to help them with Palestine. And so in 1918 or 1917, Lord Balfour promised the Zionist movement to help them establish a national home in Palestine. Well, Palestine was not part or was not occupied by the British at that time. That was part of the Ottoman Empire. So here's Lord Balfour promising the Zionist movement to help them establish a national home for the Jews in Palestine, and says it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. 90% of the population of Palestine was non-Jewish. Jewish population in Palestine at that time was 10%, and they owned less than 3% of the land. Here, the British promised them to help establish a Jewish home for the Jews in Palestine. And not only that, but the language is very clear. The indigenous population has no political rights. They have only civil and religious rights, not political rights. They have no say, basically. You just respect their civil rights and religious rights, and everything will be fine. See? So it's, yeah, that's the mentality of the British at that time. Not only the British, but all colonialist movements to the day, to the present. The indigenous peoples don't count. They don't know what's best for them. We are the civilized people, and we know what's best for everybody, and you have just to listen to us, right? So now Herzl got what he wanted. He has a sponsor. And in 1918, the war ends. The Ottoman Empire is defeated. And so the British occupy that whole area, but the fate of Palestine and the portions of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East was not quite yet decided. That gets decided 2 years later. You know, this is a timeline of what the events we'll talk about, but so we are right at 1918, at the end of World War I. So once the war ends, the British were occupying actually Palestine, Jordan, and all that stuff, but as I already mentioned, the fate of Palestine was not quite decided yet, in the sense that the British forces were simply occupying forces at the time. They had no legal control over Palestine. So in 1918, well, here the British are in Palestine. The Zionist movement sends the Zionist Commission to the British, and hey, guys, you remember Balfour Declaration? Yeah, now you're in control, help us. And so they demand from the British that Hebrew language be given the same status as Arabic. Remember, 90% of the population of Palestine are Arabs. They speak Arabic. 10% are Jewish and still speak Arabic because they are Arab. All right? And so the Hebrew was used essentially only for religious purposes at the time by the religious communities in Palestine and in Europe. You see, that's in Europe, everyday language was Yiddish in Eastern Europe, not Hebrew. Hebrew was used only for religious purposes. And yes, in Palestine, Jews spoke Hebrew, but only for prayers. Most of them spoke Arabic. Keep it until the end, please. Yeah. So the Zionist movement demand that Hebrew language be given the same status as Arabic. And also they wanted them to appoint Jews as government officials. 10% of the people. And they also wanted a Jew as a mayor of Jerusalem, and to have half the municipal council Jewish also. And well, the British acquiesced to the first two demands. They make Hebrew an official language, just like Arabic, and they appoint Jews to the government. And at the same time, the Zionists were allowed to fly their flag the stripes with the Star of David, but the Palestinians, the indigenous people there, were not. It's a nationalist symbol, right? And the Palestinians were not allowed to fly their flag. And so when the Palestinians see this, what do you think their reaction would be? Especially that they have become aware of the Balfour Declaration, which was made public by the Soviets when the Soviet Revolution took place in 1917. They got hold of the documents, they published Sykes-Picot document, and they published the Balfour Declaration. And so Palestinians became aware of that, and these actions by the British government confirmed their fears that, okay, the Jews are not coming here, or the Zionists are not coming here to actually live and escape persecution. They are here to transform the country, to take it all. And so they were alarmed, but also remember, at that time, still Britain did not have any official business in Palestine. It was an occupying force. In 1919, the Paris Peace Conference is convened. And that's what will decide what will happen with the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference is convened to divvy up the Middle East, basically, among European colonial powers. Woodrow Wilson, the US president, dispatches a commission of inquiry, because Woodrow Wilson had these grandiose, idealist ideas. He established the League of Nations after World War I. And he wanted to implement the rule of law. International law applies to the rest of the world. That's the typical liberal thinking, that everything can be resolved through negotiations and by being civil and discussing things, right? So he dispatches a commission to Palestine, the King Crane Commission, and to assess the desires of the indigenous people in that area. The Palestinians were very clear. Palestinians did not want to have a Palestinian state. Okay, so here's the thing. Palestine is a region. Has historically, until the mandate system, which I'll come to later, Palestine was simply a region. It was not a country. And Palestinians, they thought of themselves as part of greater Syria, which includes Lebanon, Syria, present-day Syria, Palestine. That was historically, all those people were actually differentiated from the rest of the Arabs that were to the south, who were nomadic peoples. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all of that, the culture there, most of the population there was nomadic. In the Levant, or what we call Bilad Asham, the Syrian country, which Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, people were settled there for a long time. And they had somewhat different cultures, not really different culture, but different customs, and because they are sedentary people. you see. And so that whole part, so Palestinians thought of themselves as Syrians, part of Syria. And they made it very clear that they do not want to be put under the tutelage of a European power, that they are perfectly capable and demonstrated to the King Crane Commission, they are perfectly capable of governing themselves. And their desire was to establish, to gain self-determination, and whatever state they would create would be a secular state with all people with different religions have the same rights as everybody else. And this was included in the report that was submitted to Woodrow Wilson. And people, the commission agreed and assessed that, yeah, they are capable of doing that. And also, one important thing is that the Palestinians said, if there must be a mandate, we don't want it to be a British mandate. We want the United States to be the mandatory power, not the British, because they did not trust them. They knew what the British were planning. Unfortunately, this report was classified as secret and never published and never acted upon. And so in 1920, the San Remo conference convenes, and that's when Palestine came under the British mandate. Basically, the same plan as Sykes-Picot was, so Syria, Lebanon go to the French, Iraq goes to the British, and the Gulf areas and Palestine. That's the change from the Sykes-Picot's Palestine was no longer to be internationalized, but came directly under the British mandate, with the caveat that the that the Balfour Declaration will be implemented. So England, or the British Empire, was sanctioned in fulfilling the promise that gave to the Zionist movement. So the Zionists knew from day one that one thing I forgot to mention actually, and that is the motivation that led the British to give the Balfour Declaration. Well, it's multifaceted because, well, they thought that, okay, the support that they would lend to the Zionist movement would help the war effort in Europe at that time, right? That, okay, the Zionists will fight alongside the Allies, you know, against the Germans. But also at the same time, you know, the British were, and that is very important because I forgot to mention that, during World War I, the British incited the Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans. They promised the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who was the great-great-grandfather of King Hussein of Jordan, who just died in the 80s, I think, something like that. But anyways, so they promised him that if he revolts against the Ottomans, they will help him establish an Arab state that would include Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and all that stuff. So they promised him to do that. At the same time, they were promising the Zionist movement to help them establish a Zionist state or Jewish state in Palestine, and at the same time, they are conspiring with the French to divvy up that whole area amongst themselves. Talk about triple crossing, you know. So, but that's the mentality at that time. So the Zionists expect resistance, and therefore they need to build a military force, basically, because there's no way that without military force that they are going to be able to maintain control over these areas. In 1921, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who's the leader of the revisionist Zionist movement. There are two main currents in the Zionist movement at the time. There's the labor Zionist, kind of moderate, that was led by Chaim Weizmann, and that was the majority current within the Zionist movement. The more militant was led by Vladimir Jabotinsky, and he's basically the father of the Likud party today. You know, all the hardcore militant settler movements are inspired and motivated by him, basically. So in 1921, Jabotinsky argues for a military power, and it says, I don't know of a single example in history where a country was colonized with the courteous consent of the population. So he knew that. And it was clear that for the Arabs that the Zionists did not want to create a joint society. In 1913, Arthur Rupin, who's an economic advisor, foresaw the creation of a Jewish milieu and of a closed Jewish economy in which producers, consumers, and middlemen will all be Jewish. And if you read in the first part, I mentioned the Jewish State pamphlet written by Theodor Herzl. Please, if you haven't read it, read it. Because this is what he says in there. So their program that Herzl put in that pamphlet is being implemented and carried out in 1920, and throughout we will see that when I talk about the third part and what's coming, you know, that when Herzl says that we will spirit the poor, we will deny the poor work in our country and spirit them across the borders. You see, that's what he was talking about. That they want to establish a pure Jewish society, not inclusive of Arabs in there. So once the British are given the mandate over Palestine, they immediately start with increasing the Jewish immigration into Palestine. And one thing that happened is that, well, in order to fulfill the idea of a Jewish state, you know, you have to own the land, right? Basically. And at that time, of course, there was, like I said, 10% of the population was Jewish, and the percentage of land that was owned by Jews was less than 3%. That cannot actually sustain the dream of a Jewish state. You have to own more land, basically. why wouldn't it sustain? It's because, well, people who own the land are not going to give it away and move out, right? They're going to fight for it. And so what the Zionist movement did is they start purchasing land. And it's very important here to know how Palestinian society at that time was structured. Most of Palestinian society was peasant. People worked the land and lived off the land. And also at the time, you know, well, during the Ottoman Empire, there wasn't really the idea of property and ownership of land was not very well defined. People worked the land, they produced stuff, they used it for their animals, they produced stuff, they survived, and that's their land, basically. There is also this notion of cooperative ownership of land or community ownership of land. That's how most Palestinian land was, is that a group of people owned some area and they divided that amongst themselves depending on the needs of each family, basically. And they will review that occasionally and over time to reallocate the land as things change, right? Now, the Ottomans, in their effort to modernize the state after in the early 1900s, they started actually giving titles to land in that area. So what happened is that large families, wealthy families, acquired a lot of this land. Most of those wealthy families lived outside of Palestine, in Lebanon. Like 60–70% of the land in Palestine was owned by few families, wealthy families. The farmers, the peasants, still lived there and farmed the land and used it basically as serfs, you know. And so when the Zionist movement started purchasing land, they went to those wealthy families. They didn't purchase them from the peasants because peasants did not own them. So they bought land from these wealthy families. There was in 1920, the laws said that, okay, when you transfer land, the peasants should remain on the land. They are given a tract of land enough to satisfy their needs, but you cannot displace them. Now, the Zionist movement was well aware of that clause, and so when they purchased land, they required that the land be free of tenants. And so what ended up happening is that all these peasants became all of a sudden without a home, without a means of subsistence. And that is consistent with what Rupert was talking about, that they have Jewish labor. But not only this was not only the peasants, any company or any business that was owned by Jews was not allowed to hire Arab labor. Because again, you cannot build a Jewish state if you are dependent on foreign, quote unquote, labor. So because of that, a lot of Palestinians find themselves in economic trouble. Peasants without land, workers cannot find jobs, and the economy right after the war was not that great. You know, because, well, Palestinians did not have capital. Their capital was the land. And the Zionist movement was dependent on capital. They had capital. They had wealthy Zionist sympathizers in Europe that had money and could actually supply capital, and so the differential in economic status was great. So the Palestinians were kind of desperate, and of course, because of the sensitivity, the fear, and the economic situation, and their realization that, well, their country is being taken away, you know, slowly, their clashes started taking place between Zionists and Palestinians. Those were isolated clashes, not any organized effort. You know, it's just something triggers an event, and then there's fighting. And there are 5 different commissions that were created between until the 30s, basically, from the 20s to in the 10 years between 1920 and 1930 or 35. There are 5 major commissions by the British to figure out why this unrest. And every single one said, well, this is why. Because Palestinians are afraid. We're taking away their land. Their economic situation is bad. They don't feel safe, and that's what happens. So as a result, you know, but nothing ever gets done about it. The Palestinians keep petitioning peacefully to the United Nations, to international opinion about their desire to have, okay, let's end this damn mandate system. We can govern ourselves. We will not require anybody to leave. We will establish a secular state. We want our self-determination. Here's you guys, Europeans, the League of Nations, talk about self-determination and international law, but it seems that it does not apply to us. So, but nobody ever listened to them. In 1935, 36, the Palestinians decide, okay, we've had it playing nice. A general strike and armed resistance starts. A general strike lasted for at least 6 months. Everything was shut down. And armed groups pick up the arms and they start fighting the British and the Zionist gangs in an effort to get them out and gain independence. Well, the British has a much bigger force. They crack down severely on the Palestinians, and not only that, but also the British arm the Zionist groups to help them fight against the Palestinians. So, but then what happened in Europe is that, well, the Nazis rise in power. And so in an effort to calm things down a little bit in Palestine. Finally, the British decide to restrict or immigration a little bit, so that, well, they calm the Arabs down, you know, and so they won't have to spend too much effort in calming things down. Things are getting bad in Europe, right? But that backfired, because now not only the Palestinians are fighting the British, but the Zionists too. Because, hey, we can't establish a Jewish state if you cannot allow immigration. And so now they have to deal with both sides. In 1946, for example, you know, and that, yeah, in 1946, the revisionist Zionist movement, led by Yitzhak Shamir, who later became prime minister in Israel, you know, his group, the Stern Gang, blows up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was the headquarters of the British administration. So that's the, I mean, I skipped a lot of details here, all right? Because I simply cannot go on with all the details that were going on between 1920 to 1930, but the gist of it, the important part is that armed resistance did not really start until the 30s, when the Palestinians have realized that they have exhausted all efforts at peaceful, good faith negotiations with the British and the international community at large. Nobody was listening to them. And so they took matters into their hands and started an armed resistance against the British and against the Zionists. Until then, and even then, the goal was not to kick the Jews who have already immigrated there. See, that was not the intent. The intent was to gain the right to self-determination and establish a representative government. That was the consistent demand of the Palestinians throughout that period, that we want a representative government of all the people who are there. Nobody's asked to leave, even the Zionists who immigrated recently. And so the situation got worse and worse for the British during the war, and finally, in 1946, well, after the blowing of the King David Hotel, the British realized that, okay, we're done here. You know, there's nothing that we can do. If we stay here, there will be more fighting, not only from the Arabs, but also from the Zionist movement. And so they referred to the whole issue of Palestine to the United Nations, which was formed after 1945. In the inter-period time, the League of Nations basically disintegrated because it has no credibility whatsoever, especially from colonized peoples, and it became clear that it was a tool of colonialist powers and not really intent on implementing any kind of equitable international law, rule of law. So in 1945, at the end of World War II, the United Nations gets established, and the whole issue of Palestine gets referred to the United Nations. Now, you guys decide. we created this big mess over there, so you, the rest of the world now, you have your say. So the United Nations decides on partitioning Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The proposed partition plan gave the Jewish state 56% of Palestine. At that time, Jewish ownership of land grew up from 3% to about 6%. The Jewish population grew from about 10% to 33%. And here's what the partition plan was. This area here, this is from 1920 to 1948. The Jewish colonies are the ones in kind of orangish color, and this is what the partition plan proposed was. So, well, Palestinians said, no, we will not take that. And as a result, war breaks out, because once the United Nations decided on the partition, the British forces start pulling out of Palestine. And what they have done is they actually gave their positions to the Zionist movement fighters. Now, a lot of the new immigrants from the Zionist immigrants into Palestine were all Europeans. Many of them had military experience because they fought in the war. And so as a result of the partition plan, the rejection of the plan by the Palestinians, war breaks out between Zionists, initially between the Zionists and the Palestinians. The Zionists were better armed, they had better weapons, and as I said, the Palestinian society was mostly peasant at the time. They had no military experience. A lot of them did not get conscripted into the Ottoman Empire, so they didn't, because they were peasants and they didn't want their children to go to the army because they need them to work the land, right? Okay, so they had no military experience. Some did, but not much. And so that was the first phase of the war. Then Arab countries, you hear this very often, oh, the Arab countries invaded. Well, let's look at the numbers. The Arab countries did not invade. Arab countries did not have any army to begin with. They were also subjugated to British rule, right? So Arab countries, Egypt was the only one that was semi-independent, actually. Jordan was also semi-independent. It had an army, but its army was commanded by a British general, Club Pasha, And Syria and Lebanon, of course, they're French ruled, and Iraq was also semi-independent. But these countries, they sent volunteers. There were initially 25,000 volunteers from all these countries went in, and that was raised to about 100,000. Zionist forces fielded about the same number of people. Okay, better armed, better trained. And the largest contingent of those was the Jordanian army. And like I said, it was commanded by a British general. So the war breaks out. In May 1948, Israel declares itself a state. And a ceasefire was negotiated. But that's not the end of the story. See, when ceasefire was negotiated, the United Nations sent an envoy to try to work things out between the newly established Zionist state and the Palestinians. They sent the Swedish diplomat, Count Folke Bernadotte, and he proposed a plan where there would be a unitary state that would include both. You know, it's some sort of confederation. But that got shut down very quick because they didn't want that. And so he proposed another solution. Okay, if you guys want 2 states, we'll give you 2 states. But he revised the borders of the Jewish state, gave less land to the Jewish state, but also insisted on the return of the refugees. Now, I didn't mention that during the war in 1948, the area that was allocated to the Jewish state included about half of the population of that state was Palestinian. 45% of the population was Palestinian, 55% was Jewish. Of course, you can't call that a Jewish state. So what happened is that during the war, about 375 to 450, there are varying numbers here, but anywhere from 370 to 450 villages were completely destroyed. The population, the Arab population in those areas that remained in those areas that did not seek safety somewhere else during the fighting were kicked out. 750,000 Palestinians, 750,000 Palestinians from the Jewish state were kicked out and became refugees. All these people that lived in this area here and this area here sought refuge in Gaza. The others either in Lebanon, Syria, or the West Bank. You know, and so the plan that was proposed by Count Bernadotte was for 700,000 Palestinians, refugees, to go back, that they should be allowed to go back. Well, what happened to Count Bernadotte? He was killed by the Lehi group, the Stern gang led by Ishaq Shamir. And so that was the end of the war in 1948. This is what remained of Palestine, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. And I already mentioned the 450, or let's say 400 villages that were completely destroyed, and the population kicked out. They sought refuge in the West Bank and Gaza, Syria, or Lebanon, and Jordan. The West Bank was annexed to Jordan and remained part of Jordan until 1967. So when I was born in Jerusalem, that was part of Jordan until 67, and therefore I was considered a Jordanian citizen, right? Palestinians in Gaza had no citizenship. They were refugees because Gaza Strip was not annexed to Egypt, but it was administered by Egypt. And so that remained until 1967. So where we are right here. So I mentioned, the support for the Zionists had multiple folds, multiple reasons. One of them was that the British thought that having a European kind of inspired or European educated or European civilized state in there would be beneficial to them because, well, of the shared values, right? The shared settler colonialist values, right? But also that Herzl said in his Jewish state that we will form there, whatever there was, a portion of the rampart of civilization against barbarism. That's to say, he was willing to do the bidding and the dirty work that those civilized Europeans could not do openly, right? One of the reasons why France and Britain wanted to partition the Ottoman Empire, and the selection or the areas that they chose, Lebanon and Syria, they had ties to France earlier on because of the missionary work that France or the Catholics did in those areas, because Lebanon had a large Catholic Maronite population with strong ties to the French. Britain, on the other hand, wanted to be close to Egypt. Why? The Suez Canal. The Suez Canal. That is a trade route, but also the land trade routes to India. They all passed by there. India was the jewel of the crown, right? And so those were the motivations for that. But also, let's not forget anti-Semitism. Balfour is quoted in the foreword in an introduction to a book written by, what's his name? Nahum Sokolov, who was a Zionist author. And he wrote a book called The History of Zionism. Lord Balfour wrote the introduction to this book. And here's what he says. The Zionist movement would mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or absorb. So, yeah, you want to take the Jews out? Yeah, be our guest. We'll help you because we don't want them here. And that is actually the reason why a lot of the European countries and also the United States did not want Jews, especially during World War II, to immigrate and seek refuge in those Western countries. That was the preferred destination for a lot of Jews escaping the Nazis. The United States, Britain, all European countries closed their borders. A ship sailing after the liberation of concentration camps. A ship was sailing to New York, loaded with survivors of the concentration camps. Reaches New York, it's turned around. The United States at that time says, oh, well, we need 100,000 survivors of the Holocaust, of the concentration camps, to go to Palestine. Because that's a humanitarian thing to do. We don't want them in the United States, but we want them in Palestine. After the liberation in 1945 of the concentration camps and all that stuff, what happened is, well, the concentration camps and people in the concentration camps remained there. Nothing was done to get them out and rehabilitate them. Many of them did not want to go back to their homes because their homes did not exist anymore. And of course, there's real trauma that they went through. They didn't want to associate with those people. So what happened is that the administration of the camps was turned basically to the Zionist movement. And all these poor people, traumatized, hungry, lost everything, they become target to indoctrination. They just wanted to get the hell out of there. They didn't care where to go. They just wanted to get out of there. And so the Zionist representatives in control of these camps, they teach them, well, when you're asked, where do you want to go? Palestine. And so that, after World War II, and that was also part of the, how you say, the reasons, that mentality of mainly European powers that, hey, we caused this trouble. Our persecution of the Jews, our anti-Semitism, our all that stuff culminated in the Holocaust. Now we got to atone for that and get everybody out of there into Palestine. Let's commit another crime. Okay? So that was part of the motivation for the partition plan. Nobody really accepted the idea that Palestinians had a legitimate claim to the land. And so, anyway, the occupation of 3/4, or actually in, what was it, 78% after 1948, 78% of Palestine was occupied and became what is known as Israel and the remaining parts, West Bank and Gaza, I mentioned West Bank annexed by Jordan, and Gaza remained basically under British administration. So, like I said, the British were counting on Israel or the Zionists to do its bidding. In 1953, there was a revolution in Egypt. President Nasser came to power, and one of the first things he does is he nationalizes the Suez Canal. Well, how dare he? In 1956, Israel launches an attack, prompted and, how to say, prompted by the British and the French. They attack Egypt, and the France and Britain join in, but the United States intervenes, and Roosevelt, at the time, I think, Eisenhower, yes, you're right. Eisenhower forces them to withdraw and stop their aggression. That's essentially the only time, actually, that the United States did anything good in that area. So in 1967, well, between 1948 and 1967, there were all these clashes that were constantly going on. I remember as a kid, there's always some event, something, skirmishes across the borders, exchanging thing like that, but nothing really serious. 56 was the biggest event that took place. But in 1967, there was a lot of rhetoric that was going on from the Arab states, Arab countries. One of them, well, Nasser was a pan-Arabist. What that means is that he was a nationalist, and he wanted to have a unified Arab world and do away with the borders between Arab countries, which were the creation of colonial powers. So that was his thrust. Nasser was beloved by all Arabs. He was very charismatic, and he did not come from a wealthy family at all, and he spoke the language of the people. People loved him. I remember, actually, in Jordan it was forbidden to listen to his speeches. And so we would huddle around the radio when he was speaking, to listen to him at very low volume so that the sound could not be heard outside the house. And he, in 1964, actually, he created the PLO. At the time, the Palestinians had no independent representation. See, like I said, Palestinians in the West Bank were Jordanians. Palestinians in Gaza were semi-independent, but they were under Egyptian control. And the issue of Palestine was central to all Arab politics at the time. And Nasser, being a pan-Arabist, he could not ignore that. So he founded the PLO with the Palestine Liberation Army. That was basically an army under Egyptian command. It was not independent. The only independent Palestinian voice came in 1965 when Yasser Arafat founded and created Fatah. The Fatah in Arabic is an acronym, means the Movement for the Liberation of Palestine. But actually it's reversed. It's really funny because the acronym in Arabic would be HATF. HATF means death. So that's not good. That's not good. We're gonna call it Fatah, which means actually conquest. But it is an acronym. حركة المقاومة الفلسطينية, Movement for the Liberation of Palestine. And the thing is that Fatah was a liberation movement, did not have really any ideology. So, which made it kind of vulnerable to interference and co-option by different Arab regimes and powers. There are other groups that were founded after Fatah, mainly the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a Marxist pan-Arab movement. That they were inspired by Marxism as an ideology, but also they were nationalists and following Nasser's thrust in wanting to unify the Arab world. Their motto was, the liberation of Palestine passes through Arab capitals. That's because, well, all these regimes were installed by colonial powers, essentially, except for Egypt, really. You know, there were, later on, there were revolts and things like that, but and then a group split from the PFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And if you guys watched the Life of Brian, you will know what I'm talking about. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Judea and the, you remember that? When they go in, yeah, they're making fun of that, basically. Yeah, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine is split from the PFLP. They are also Marxist, not nationalist. They are pro-Soviet. And their main recruiting grounds were the refugee camps. So, so that's when actually the official Palestinian resistance, independent of Arab countries, although this is not strictly true because all of these movements were present in Arab countries. They're not in Palestine. Well, let me rephrase that. They were not in occupied Palestine. They were in Gaza, they were in Syria, they were in Jordan, they were in Lebanon, because remember, most of the Palestinians in occupied Palestine, which became the state of Israel, were kicked out. Those Palestinians who remained in what became known as Israel, their only avenue for organizing was the Communist Party, because it was the Israeli Communist Party that was legal, but you could not express any independent Palestinian voice. They were under military rule from 1948 to 1964, 65. So in 67, what happened is that the Nasser closes the Suez Canal for Israeli ships or ships bound to Israel. And, well, Israel, of course, was not happy about that. And they were threatening to attack and all that stuff. The United States was calming things down and working an agreement with Egypt. They were close to achieving an agreement when Israel launches an attack against Egypt. June 5, 1967. I remember it was a Monday. I was 11 years old. And the Jordan and Syria join in because they had an agreement, a common defense agreement with Egypt. So they join in, but the strongest army was actually the Egyptian army. The Air Force, the Egyptian Air Force was decimated on the tarmac because the Israeli attack. That's what the Israelis attacked, is the Egyptian Air Force. Without Air Force, then it was gone. So that's when, what happened? So that's when the rest of Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, and Golan Heights and Sinai were occupied. And so this is the end of part 2. We'll take part 3, and so now we'll have questions. And so what I would like to ask is that please, if you have comment, wait until the end of questions. I'd rather take questions of things that you need clarified that were not necessarily clear during the talk. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, okay. Arif, I'm interested in how things looked on the ground before the Zionists were even a thing. And there were Arabs and Jews living, they're all speaking Arabic.
Yeah.
In the Palestine region. Were there scuffles, or did they just say, hey, you're a Jew, I don't do Jewish things, but I'm okay with that? Or was there a problem?
In Jerusalem, there are 3 cities that are really important for Jews: Hebron, Jerusalem, and Safed. Okay, and all 3 had sizable Jewish population for eons because of their religious significance. And I wish I had pictures, but there are pictures of Arabs and Jews just walking side by side, normal people living equally. They're all subjects of the Ottoman Empire. And as long as people did not step on other people's toes, nobody cared how they worshipped. Palestinian society, 25% of Palestinians are Christian. The majority are Muslim, but there are also Jews. There were intermarriages. And my dad always told me the story that when he was a kid, that was pre-1948, when he was a kid, his neighbors were Jewish, and during the Sabbath, Friday evening into Saturday. See, they could not do work and all that stuff. So he would go turn on the lights for them, and stuff like that. I heard a, a rabbi, actually, who was saying that it was normal that, well, they would take care of our kids, we would take care of their kids, we would celebrate each other's weddings and festivals and all that stuff. People lived normally like people do. You know, there was no issues. You worship. You see, this is the thing. And for Muslims, Christians and Jews are to be respected because they believe in the same God. It's not like Muslims don't believe that Jews and Christians believe in a different God. No, it's the same God. Muslims believe that Jesus and Moses were prophets. Muhammad is the last prophet. And the Christians and Jews have not followed Muhammad, but that does not mean that they are non-believers. And so they have to be respected and protected. Yes.
Yeah, Arif, thank you so much. This is my first time hearing you, and it's remarkable how accurate and how clear your narrative is. It's really
Thank you.
it's really good to hear. I just want some clarification on the refugee camps.
Mm-hmm.
So here's from what I understand you saying, and the little that I do understand. I was recently in Israel, in the West Bank, and um, worked with people who have worked in the refugee camps, and that there have been generations of
Mm-hmm.
Palestinians in the refugee
Yes.
camps. So I hear this from Palestinians, I hear from Israeli Jews, we didn't start the refugee camps. And I'm hearing, and you help me piece this together if you would, that in the West Bank, because that was actually part of Jordan, if I'm understanding,
Mm-hmm.
that when the Palestinians were actually kicked out during the Nakba and went into Jordan, I'm curious if you can help me understand a little bit of why did Palestinians end up in refugee camps, if that is accurate.
Well, yeah. What happened is that originally those refugee camps were tent camps, right? Established and created by the United Nations to accommodate all the influx of those people coming all at once and seeking refuge. The expectation was that they would be able to return after hostilities end, after the war. But of course, Israel did not allow those refugees to go back. Every year, there's a United Nations Resolution 194, I believe, or 191. Every year, it is affirmed the right of refugees to return to their homes, you know, if they want to, or be compensated if they choose to remain outside. So Israel has not allowed the refugees to go back. And they remained in the refugee camps with the anticipation that someday they will be able to go back, but of course that never happened. And because of the growth of population, the tents were replaced by buildings. They are still dependent on aid from the United Nations, UNRWA, essentially, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, that provides education and work opportunities for Palestinians in those refugee camps. Partly, it is a desire of the Palestinians that, okay, well, we do not want to necessarily, many Palestinians integrated within Jordan, and Lebanon and all that stuff. In Syria, in Lebanon, for example, you see, Palestinians, very few have Lebanese citizenship, right? Very few. Most of them are denied the right to citizenship because they are Palestinian refugees. And same thing in Gaza. In Gaza, refugees were never given Egyptian citizenship. They only had travel documents that would allow them to leave and get back. In Jordan, on the other hand, Palestinians have citizenship, and many people in Jordan have left the refugee camps, and the refugee camps are called refugee camps, but now they are essentially cities within small cities. They're not tent and all that stuff, and Palestinians who live in there have had citizenship of Jordan, camps in Jordan, that is, and the West Bank. But it is a deliberate thing from Palestinians to keep the memory that we are refugees. We want our homes. For example, you see, I never lived in a refugee camp. My parents, their property is in West Jerusalem. West Jerusalem was part of Israel in 1948. In 1948, they sought refuge in East Jerusalem. So they lost their property. In 2019, I went with my wife, who has never been there. She's American. We went to Jerusalem. And I took her to show her my grandfather's house. To this day, the original gate of the house is still there. I am named after my grandfather. His initials, A.N., are on that gate. Now, a relative of ours tried to gain his folks' property in West Jerusalem also. What happened is, you see, when Palestinians initially, a lot in Jerusalem, most people lived in the old city of Jerusalem. As population grew, you can't go outside the walls you can't build outside the walls. You can't push the walls of the old city out. So they started building outside. And for safety and social life, families lived together. So you'll hear this is the Nashashibi quarter, or this is the Hosseini quarter. That's where all members of that family lived. And so the same thing with my family. A relative tried to reclaim his father's property. What the Israelis did, they demolished it. So it is a reminder for us, for Palestinians, that we are refugees. We have the right to go back to our property. That is what has been stipulated by the United Nations, by international law, and that's really it. Yeah, I hope that answers.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
In the back there.
I have a few questions, so I don't want to take up too much if
Yeah.
other people do. My first question is, it sort of seems obvious, but just to clarify, what was it that prevented the Palestinian voice from being heard to the point where they felt like, over a 10-year period that they had to take up arms? Was it just racism? Was it just the colonial structure?
Have you read Edward Said?
No.
Okay. I encourage you to read one of his books. It's a very difficult book. Skip the introduction. because it is very hard to get through the introduction. Orientalism. It's basically the way indigenous people are viewed by the West, right? You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you need. We know best. We are the civilized, you are the savages. That's the fundamental premise upon which the United States has been built. Manifest destiny. White man's burden. We are here in a civilizing mission. We want to educate those savages, bring European enlightenment to them, and all not realizing that, hey, those cultures have been there for centuries, for thousands of years. They have their own culture, which may be different than yours. And so Europeans appreciate Chinese art, Arabic calligraphy, and all that stuff. All the artifacts that are produced by this culture, but the people themselves, that culture itself, is not valued and is not considered as mature enough to actually be able to govern itself. Like I said, you see, I mean, traditionally, land ownership in Palestine was communal. Decisions were made communally, collectively. Is democracy better? I don't know. But that's how people lived, and they were happy, and that created a life for them that was consistent, and they were familiar with their needs. Now you try to come and impose a system on somebody else that they have not been used to it, you know, thinking that their system is backward and obsolete. Well, that's the reason. Yeah.
Another question is, there's this myth that the UN gave the Jews a state, but I recently learned, and I saw in the Balfour Declaration, the word homeland was used. Did the UN ever declare a Jewish state, or was it only in 1948 when the Zionists had a military?
Well,
They declared a state.
Homeland could also mean a state, but then, and it was, the United Nations did not, well, created the state of Israel in the sense that they sanctioned the partition of Palestine into two states. But like I said, the issue did not start in 1948. It started before that with the colonial powers promising territory that they did not own to somebody else. Establishing a homeland, knowing what the Zionist movement, through what they were saying and doing, their intent was not there to live peacefully as equal with the Palestinians, but rather to replace them. There is an event after this at 3:30. We have to wrap up. I will be available, and I would be very happy to talk and continue this discussion after that. But I have to wrap it because we need to clear this area. Thank you very much.